In this lecture, I plan to close the course on Alexander the Great and offer something of an assessment of Alexander's contribution to military history, but also the impact he had for later generations, particularly those generations after the Hellenistic world, that is the immediate aftermath of Alexander's career. The types of images that were transmitted about what a young conqueror should be, as well as just the general notion that this young Macedonian king who died at the age of 32, just before his 33rd year, had achieved so much in such a short time that he in many ways becomes the standard for excellence and is often used as a comparison for excellence in almost any type of endeavor, which makes him, as I said in the opening lecture at the very start of this course, essentially the most well-known secular figure in history, bar none. Of course, there are great religious leaders and thinkers that would score ahead of him in recognition, but among everyone who is not associated with any kind of religious activity or vision, Alexander comes out first. Well, that requires us to look at several aspects of Alexander's career. First and foremost, his role as a general. That's where he made his reputation, that's how he was remembered immediately, and that is what won him the Persian Empire in such a short time. His four great battles are without a doubt masterpieces. Very few commanders have fought such perfect battles in their career. The first two battles I would like to stress would be those of the Battle of the Granicus and the Battle of Issus, fought in 334 and 333 BC. We discussed them in some detail. But just remember that on both instances, Alexander arrived on the battlefield late in the day. He moved his army out of column of march into column of battle, an extremely difficult tactic to pull off. Furthermore, he conceived his strategy and his master plan in a very short time by observing the terrain, the dispositions of the enemy. He had a phenomenal ability to read terrain and enemy intention and then come up with his own plan and impose his will on the battlefield. At the Hydaspes in India in 326 BC, during the monsoon, or at least early in the monsoon season, he effected a river crossing at night. He assembled his army, fought against an opponent with weapons, that is, the elephants, that had only recently become known to Alexander, carried out a masterful cavalry battle to take the Indian army in flank. The Battle of Arbela, or Gaugamela, is perhaps his greatest masterpiece. It is a strategic piece of genius, the way he organized his army, a much smaller army on an open field, parried the attacks of the Persian chariots and cavalry, and issued a lightning charge to the center that shattered the Persian army. In all of these battles, Alexander never lost the strategic vision of what victory meant. He never pursued his enemy so far that he ruined or jeopardized the rest of his army, notably Parmenio. If these battles are as brilliant as the sources describe, they really are, with few exceptions. They're really on the order of the battles of Napoleon. One has to think of Austerlitz as a comparable piece of genius. Curtius Rufus, the historian writing the Roman age, constantly stressed that on the eve of each battle, Alexander did consult with his officers. And I believe that's true. And I think Curtius captures an important element in the generalship of Alexander that's missed often in reading Arrian and Plutarch, who tend to stress the great king himself. Alexander had another ability, and that was to get the best out of his officers, his commanders. That included not only the senior generals such as Parmenio and later Craterus, but also the commanders of the phalanx, the companions, and those Macedonian officers who were put in charge of specialized units such as Greek mercenaries, Thracians, or other types, later on Iranian units that had been recruited into the Macedonian army. He could communicate his vision to these men. And in this sense, again, the comparison to Napoleon comes up. Napoleon was served by a brilliant set of marshals, any one of them an able general in his own right, but none of them possessing individually or collectively the genius of Napoleon. And I think the same is true of Alexander, and efforts to attribute Alexander's victories to Parmenio and his officers, I think, are ill-founded. Alexander communicated that vision to his officers. They were extremely able men. Those who survived the expedition in Asia went on to distinguish themselves both as generals and in many instances became kings in their own right. It is remarkable the type of talent that Alexander had collected around him. And these were men who also displayed great administrative talent, such as Ptolemy, Hephaestion, the best friend of Alexander, not just successes on the battlefield. And I think that is another testimony to Alexander's genius. The strategic vision, the logistics, the ability to wage wars of pacification, to conduct sieges at record time. It is extraordinary how no matter what part of the military science, or probably more accurately art, one is essentially practicing the art of war rather than implementing it. It's a great deal of improvisation. Alexander could conduct brilliant lightning campaigns in the Balkans and Central Asia. The pacification of Central Asia just took a little over 2.5 years. And in recent years, fighting in those tough regions of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the former Soviet Central Asia has revealed how difficult that terrain has always been and how strategic it has always been as well. In India, his army solved remarkable logistical problems. They built fleets both for the Indus Valley, for the Indus River system, as well as for the return home voyage. The logistics of Alexander, we know in general that he did not use wheeled carts, that the Macedonian army carried its own equipment. But beyond that, we have very little accurate information on how these logistics were implemented. Yet, Alexander's army achieved record marching speeds, surprised his enemies repeatedly, both in the great campaigns, such as Darius III at Gaugamela, or in the many small wars in Central Asia and India, where the army of the Macedonians just appears unexpectedly. The most remarkable, of course, is that pursuit across northern Iran to capture Darius in 330 BC. These were record-breaking marches. Few armies have ever achieved that kind of marching speed, and it's essentially an army that moved by foot. It had a cavalry component. We are just in the dark, to a large extent, how these logistics were achieved. Much of it was by acquiring resources from the local population. There was scouting and communications. How this information was gathered and processed by Alexander's sense of vision is little known, but obviously he pulled it off. It is also difficult to comprehend how extraordinary this military achievement and the conquest of the Persian Empire must have seemed to contemporaries and for the rest of the people of antiquity and then down to this day. I guess it's in part the problem that Alexander made the conquest of the Persian Empire in a way look too easy. I have stressed repeatedly in the course how exceptional that campaign, that 10-year campaign to conquer the Persian Empire was in the whole grand scheme of things. It was just stunning that this young Macedonian king could overthrow the Achaemenid Empire. No one would have imagined it possible. At the start of the expedition, most observers, the Greeks, many of whom were hostile to Alexander, King Darius III himself, and perhaps even the satraps in Asia Minor, who had the misfortune of battling Alexander at the Granicus, must have thought that the young king was simply mad. There would be absolutely no way that anyone could pull off this type of event. And yet he did. This image inspired a remarkable set of art, including sculpture by Lysippus, the favorite artist of Alexander the Great, and then a succession of depictions of the king all through antiquity down to the present day, in which Alexander comes across as the young, heroic conqueror on the horse, that individual who could accomplish so much in a brilliant short career, impatient, and at the same time having that enthusiasm and exuberance of youth combined with the genius that one would find usually in a far more mature mind. That image is what is conveyed in the art. It is best seen again in that mosaic that has survived from Pompeii, which we believe is based on an original painting of Alexander, where he is winning the Battle of Issus, and he comes across as that heroic young man on the horse. In the immediate aftermath of Alexander, it is noteworthy that several of his imitators, notably Pyrrhus, the Red King of Epirus, who attempted to repeat Alexander's adventures of conquest in the Western Mediterranean, had the misfortune of running into Roman legionaries, which put a stop to that, or Demetrius Poliorcetes, the dashing son of Antigonus the One-Eyed, who styled himself the new Alexander, both of them attempted operations on the scale of Alexander, and to be sure, they encountered some difficult opponents, but they could never achieve anything remotely like what Alexander had done. And that was just not a matter of conditions. They were just not up to the level of Alexander. And one thinks of Plutarch's assessment on both of them as essentially imitators rather than emulators and successors of Alexander. So it's understandable why the various rulers of the Hellenistic age would look to Alexander as a king, as a general, as a god, as an inspiration for forging their kingdoms, for inspiring their diverse subjects, and for comparing their own achievements against that of Alexander the Great. I think what is more extraordinary that this tradition of emulating Alexander in the Hellenistic world, as well as Alexander's achievements, then becomes part of a heritage, a classical heritage, that jumps essentially civilization and language barriers and makes this Macedonian king the hero, really the hero that later generations, for at least in the Western tradition, have repeatedly used as a standard. The Romans were the first to come to terms with this extraordinary individual. And this was difficult for the Romans because I've stressed that the Romans built their civilization largely on the collective achievements of its aristocracy, the so-called nobiles, the men who held high office, its citizens who served in the legions, and above all, its political institutions, which were the pride of Roman civilization and to which we are still largely heirs. Nonetheless, the Romans had to acknowledge that a great deal of their success in the Mediterranean world, particularly in the eastern half of the Mediterranean world, was owed to the career of Alexander the Great. He forged the Hellenistic world, which became the foundation of at least the eastern half of their world empire, and I would argue to a very large extent the whole of the Roman Empire was based in one way or another on Hellenistic models that came out of the career of Alexander the Great. Historians, orators, philosophers, and Roman commanders themselves all tried to understand what did Alexander mean to them. The Roman historian Livy, writing in the time of Augustus, goes to great lengths saying Alexander truly was a great general, but if he had marched west in his later years, if he had lived longer, he would have run into all of these great Roman commanders, and collectively we really would have beaten Alexander just as we did Pyrrhus and Hannibal and other commanders. It's really a case of special pleading, and it's part of that ambiguous relationship the Romans had with Alexander. In some ways, they were absolutely impressed by him. Each Roman would emulate himself after Alexander in one fashion or another, anyway, any Roman of ambition. But at the same time, Alexander was, in a way, the very negation of Roman civilization. His was the achievement of a single man, as opposed to a Roman civilization that rested on the collective achievements of many men. Among the various commanders in the Roman tradition, starting with Scipio Africanus, Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, the commander who defeated Hannibal in the Second Punic War, there were studied imitations of Alexander. Scipio was noted for his clementia, in Latin meaning his clemency. One thinks of his capture of New Carthage in Spain in 210 BC when he released all these Spanish hostages, including many fine-looking, high-born Iberian women. It was an imitation of the way Alexander treated the Persian captives, all of the royal family, right after the Battle of Issus. One of the most remarkable commanders of the late Roman Republic is Pompey the Great, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus in his Roman Latin form of the name, and Magnus was assumed by Pompey as his third name, the cognomen, in direct imitation of Alexander, who was now already known as Alexander the Great, not as Alexander the Third. And Pompey, too, tried to imitate Alexander with less fortunate results. The best example of that comes when Pompey returns from Africa, having suppressed various Marian rebels there. He stages a triumph in Rome. This is the grand parade to celebrate his victories. And again, he has this Alexander fixation, and he's about 31 or 30 at the time, so he's close to Alexander at the time of Alexander's death. And what he does is he has a chariot decked out in elephants with all sorts of imagery that would be appropriate to Alexander, and then discovers as he is marching in his parade through the gates of Rome that the elephants won't go through the gates of Rome. There's a rather embarrassing halt in the triumph. There's a lot of confusion. The elephants are substituted with white horses, not one of Pompey's better days. But again, an indication of to what lengths Romans would go in imitating Alexander. Perhaps the best imitator, and certainly the one understood by Plutarch, was Julius Caesar, that remarkably charming and absolutely outrageous man, someone everyone would love to invite him to a dinner party because of his brilliant wit, but I wouldn't trust him politically for a moment. In any event, there were two incidents reported about Julius Caesar, and again, they come from the Plutarch account of Caesar's life. One is when Caesar was 32 years of age, and in Spain, he saw a statue of Alexander at the city of Cadiz, and he broke down weeping. That now I'm Julius Caesar, and I'm 32 years of age, and what have I achieved? At 32, Alexander had conquered the world. Later on in Julius Caesar's career, in 47 or 46 BC, when he's in Alexandria in Egypt, Caesar is a bit older, but he's now master of the Roman world. Then he can, with some sense of dignity and accomplishment, visit the tomb of Alexander, that is the mausoleum built by Ptolemy I. The tour guide was very impressed on how Caesar saw Alexander's tomb and with great reverence and almost a sense, well, I now am worthy to be in your presence, Alex. I've conquered the world just as you did. And then when the tour director asked, would you like to see the tomb of Ptolemy I and the other Ptolemies, J.C. simply said, no, I came here to see a king, not a bunch of corpses. Later Roman emperors likewise imitated Alexander, megalomaniacs like Nero and Caligula, as well as the Emperor Trajan, who was the emperor who ruled at the time that Arrian wrote his account of Alexander the Great. And these comparisons continued through the Roman age. And as I noted, not only did it jump the language barrier from Greek to Latin, from Greek to Roman civilization, but even in various endeavors. A number of well-known philosophers in the late Roman world start this tradition of comparing Alexander as the standard of excellence in any endeavor by comparing their achievements to those of Alexander the Great. Two of them are Apollonius of Tyana, who is a well-known philosopher, probably living at the end of the first, beginning of the 2nd century AD. He undertakes a legendary trip to India, and of course Plotinus, the brilliant Neoplatonic philosopher who summed up pagan philosophy and created the henotheism that allowed Julian to rally the cults in 360 and 363 AD. Both of them, he too, planned a trip to India to see the Brahmins, to see the sophists of the East, as they'd call them, and they deliberately compare these trips to Alexander going off to India, drawing that analogy that they were the men of thought and contemplation, the way Alexander was the man of action who was trained by Aristotle. And in a sense, when they came up for a comparison to their great travels and search for knowledge, they didn't come up with Aristotle, but they came up with Alexander as their example, which then carries over into all of this Vulgate or popular tradition, the various Alexander romances that circulated in the later world of antiquity and were transmitted to the peoples of the Middle Ages, both Christians and Muslims. In medieval romances, Alexander comes off as the perfect knight who traversed distant lands of the East, battled monsters, battled fabulous men, and ultimately proved that while not a Christian, he was in that remarkable category of righteous pagans who, if he had lived in the time of Christ, would have been a Christian, and sets the model for chivalrous conduct for all Christians to come. Alexander is one of the few figures of classical antiquity that captured the imagination of medieval Islam. He's usually known as Iskandar. He is remembered as a master of nature, as writing magic carpets, as ordering the cosmos. It is from the Islamic sources that we obtain stories of Alexander's delight in exploring. And this is stressing that whole tradition that we see, particularly in Plutarch's account and Curtius Rufus' account, where Alexander had this insatiable pothos to learn, to understand lands, peoples, exotic animals. And that gives rise to the story of Alexander being lowered into the Mediterranean in a great glass container in order to ward off sea creatures while he is attempting to build the city of Alexandria, or is carried up into the sky by similar apparatus. It is a remarkable image of Alexander, and it is part of that king's whole mystique that goes beyond just his position as a king and as a conqueror. With the major changes in European society, with the Renaissance, which gives us this perspective of antiquity and the Middle Ages, something that was not possessed by the people of the Middle Ages, but a notion from the late 15th and 16th century on that Europeans were heirs to two distinct historical periods, that of antiquity and that of the Middle Ages. And of course, the Middle Ages always suffers in that comparison, because no one wants to be middle-aged under any circumstance. Medievalists have ever since tried to come up with better names for their period. But in any case, in the Renaissance, Alexander moves from that fantastic explorer, the chivalrous knight, into a more sober comparison, and one that has endured down to this day. His military accomplishments are rediscovered. This is a result of the receiving of the Greek text from Byzantium, the translation of these texts into Latin, the transmission of the classical heritage to Western Europe, that gives rise to part of what is often known as the military revolution. That was in part technological, the discovery of gunpowder and the development of artillery and then handheld firearms. But what went hand in hand with that technology was the rediscovery of classical texts that talked about armies that marched in step, that brought back notions of discipline and professionalism, and inspired the creation of the modern armies of Europe, early modern Europe, of the 16th century, that led to the creation not only of modern warfare, but of nation states. And once again, Alexander is the innovator, the model. He becomes a model for Cortés in the conquest of Mexico, and Diaz, in his account of the conquest of Mexico, does make reference to Alexander. In many ways, all commanders, starting from the 16th century down to the present day, take the Roman army as the model of the professional army. For instance, one thinks of the armies of Gustavus Adolphus, the great Swedish king, who revolutionized warfare in the 17th century. His Swedish army was known as the New Legions, but Gustavus himself would look to Alexander as his comparison. So did his successor, Charles XII of Sweden, who styled himself as the Alexander of the North until he ran into Peter the Great at Poltava in 1709, and with certain unfortunate consequences. Charles XII loved carrying out cavalry charges, just like Alexander. Renaissance princes, kings of the Ancien Regime, all of them depicted themselves astride horses in heroic guises, always stressing the youth, that indescribable charismatic quality that would inspire loyalty among their men and their subjects. Clearly, Napoleon was the greatest imitator of Alexander. His invasion of Egypt was an obvious comparison to Alexander, and ironically, one of Napoleon's most successful opponents, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, evoked the same images, as well as constantly corrected Napoleon's French for not being quite up to standard. Scholars and those who had to endure the 20th century, which never was there a more depressing century in my mind in European history, again ended up making comparisons to Alexander the Great to the totalitarian dictators Hitler and Stalin both, which has profoundly influenced our understanding of, or perceptions of, Alexander in this generation of scholarship. Perhaps I should close with two more recent imitations or evocations of that comparison to Alexander. The first one is, perhaps a bit fanciful and outrageous, but in Trump Taj Mahal Resort Hotel, the most opulent and spectacular suite was the Alexander the Great suite. Need I say more? The second comparison, which really bowled me over when I heard it back in 1991, is when the American General Norman Schwarzkopf was asked by various newscasters what allowed for the American victory in the first Iraq War back in 1991. And Schwarzkopf explained, yes, it was the discipline of our army, all of these advantages, but he ultimately said it was the generalship and the inspiration of not only himself, but all those officers and men on the battlefield. And it didn't matter what the technological differences it was, that the disparities in technology, the size of numbers. What it was the will and the ability to impose, the Americans could impose their position on the battlefield. And the immediate comparison he came up with was Alexander the Great at the Battle of Gaugamela. And he went into great detail discussing how Darius had all these chariots and cavalry and outnumbered them, the Macedonian army. But in the end, Alexander won through. And that was the example he took. It is extraordinary that on the spur of a moment, this American commander in the late 20th century, when he has to recall what incident most sums up, that gives you that decisive edge on the battlefield, despite all the changes in technology that have occurred, the image that comes up is Alexander's greatest victory, the Battle of Gaugamela. With these notions of and opinions about Alexander's enduring influence, I would like to close with one final remark, and that is in understanding the overall impact of Alexander's career. The images are powerful. They have gone through the centuries. They have been transmitted from the Hellenistic world down to us. And there's something behind those images, because that career did transcend just a spectacular career of conquest. The motives of Alexander were largely personal. And I do believe the accounts of Arrian and Plutarch that Pothos, this desire to emulate his ancestors, was far more important than any other grander scheme, whether it be the Pan-Hellenic war against the Persians or the expansion of Macedonian power, or whatever. Nonetheless, the impact was real. Questions are usually asked about what would have happened if Alexander had lived longer. That's a question often asked of me by friends, acquaintances, students. I think the question that's more important to ask and is seldom asked is, what would have happened if there had been no Alexander? That is something in my mind that is inconceivable. Because without Alexander the Great, the changes in the ancient world just would never have happened. He dramatically, decisively, forever changed the relationship between the Greek world and the Near East. He put Greek civilization in the ascendancy. He made possible those Hellenistic kingdoms and institutions upon which Rome would build as the institutional heir to Alexander. And I do admit that the Romans achieved successes in imposing their great empire and the Roman peace that Alexander himself could never have imagined. And yet, nonetheless, that great collective achievement of the Romans rested on this extraordinary individual, Alexander the Great, who had dramatically conquered the Persian Empire, overthrown a powerful empire of over 250 years, and had rested on institutions evolved in the Near East for some 25 centuries, and made Hellenic civilization, resting on that peculiar city-state, the polis, the centerpiece of Western civilization for the next 1,000 years. The achievement is extraordinary. The results are just undeniable. And I would say, in answering that question, if there had been no Alexander the Great, if there had been no Persian conquest, if that career had not occurred, if that exceptional individual had not so decisively changed his world, well, quite simply put, without Alexander and his unique genius, there would have been no Caesar, there would have been no Christ, there would have been no Western civilization as we understand us, and ladies and gentlemen, we wouldn't be here right now.